You can see the title of the sermon this morning, The Writings on the Wall. Have you ever heard somebody use that phrase before? The writings on the wall? Well, this morning, the reason I use that title is because it obviously has kind of a dual meaning, all right? The writings on the wall when it comes to King Belshazzar in Daniel chapter 5, as we're going to see. But the writings on the wall for us as a church, the church, and the writings on the wall for our country and for our world. What is that writing that we're speaking of? Well, it's the writing, the warning, the heeding that we need to take that concerns the judgment of God and what the Bible says about it. And I fear that in many ways the church has turned a blind eye to what's happening all around us because either it's too threatening, it's too difficult to think about, or it's just simply something we would rather not, discuss or have to address. And folks, I dare say that it is something we have to address. It's something we have to not be silent about. What we see taking place, what we see happening, it is now our time to sound the trumpet, sound the warnings, right? But I think there's some things that we can learn here this morning from King Belshazzar's situation that I think will be very applicable to us this morning and I hope will be also helpful. This is a rather long chapter, but I want to read the whole chapter this morning as we begin, and then we'll walk through and break it down little by little. And so bear with me as we do this, but I trust, again, you'll be encouraged, that you will be, in some cases, even awoken to what is happening and to what our responsibility is as a church. Daniel chapter 5, verse 1. Notice what Scripture says. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Verse 5, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, opposite the lampstand. The king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise man of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you, or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. I have heard of you, that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give the interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would he killed, and whom he would he kept alive. Whom he would he raised up, and whom he would he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened, so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down to his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all of this. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know. But the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. Then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed, Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Pharsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Well, let's break down this chapter now that we've read the entire thing. And let's notice some very, very important things. We're going to break these down into just categories, if you will. And as we walk through this, we will then have some applications. All right? Notice with me, first of all, the party. The party. This is what was happening here in Babylon, this very moment. That is that Belshazzar decided that he was going to throw a banquet or a feast or an orgy for 1,000 of his lords, the Bible says. This was in every way a sexually perverted party, as best as we can tell. It had nothing good about it. And here's what we realize, folks. Ungodly men know how to throw wild parties, but Almighty God knows how to crash them, doesn't he? And that's exactly what happened here in Daniel chapter 5. Belshazzar decided he was going to do that, and God decided he was going to show up and send Belshazzar a completely different message to say, you can't sin and win. You can't do this kind of thing and think that I'm going to be pleased with it. And so Belshazzar throws this party. And during the midst of this party, in a drunken state, Belshazzar commands that the vessels that were taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought into his chambers and that they drink the wine from those. So they were brought in, and they desecrated those very things, those very sacred cups and very sacred portions of the temple, those vessels of gold and silver. They desecrate them. And if that weren't bad enough, they then begin to sing praises to idols. As Daniel 5 tells us, they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood and stone. This was what this party was made up of. Sounds like a lot of fun. Or maybe not, right? But this was what was taking place, and this is why God showed up, and this is why God had to send a message to Belshazzar that something here needs to be done, needs to be stopped. But then notice here, as that party is happening then, there was a response from God in verses 5 through 9. It says, immediately, as they were doing this, fingers showed up and began to write on the plaster of the wall a message. A message that was confusing. Now imagine if you were Belshazzar and you see this take place, right? You're sitting there having a great time, or so you think. You feel untouchable. You feel like you have all the power in the world. And all of a sudden, this hand shows up out of nowhere, not connected to anyone or anything, and begins to scratch a message on the wall. You'd probably react just as Belshazzar did. The color leaves your face. You sink down in your throne, and your knees start to knock together. That's what happened to Belshazzar. He was scared silly. Couldn't believe that this was taking place. He probably thought to himself, what's in this alcohol that I'm drinking? But oh, make no mistake, my friend, it wasn't the alcohol that was speaking to him that night. Not at all. It was God himself, writing a message clear and plain as day, so to speak, to Belshazzar, that no longer was his sin going to be tolerated, or the way in which he was leading this current nation. So immediately out of this scared state, he calls his astrologers and he calls his magicians in, and he needs to know immediately what this message means and what it's saying. None of them can do it. And so it brings us then to the next section, which is that there's a special need on the part of the king. That special need is that this message be interpreted, that it be shown to him what exactly this message means. Now you have to understand, Belshazzar here, though he's known as king, his father Nabonidus was the actual king. And his father was out conquering different lands, and he left Belshazzar in charge. Nabonidus was the son of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was Belshazzar's grandfather. Belshazzar was a boy when he saw what happened to his grandfather. That's why the scriptures say that he did this despite the fact that he knew what happened to his grandfather previously. So Daniel reminds him of this when he comes. But the queen here shows up. This is most likely his mother, Belshazzar's mother. And she says, hey, there's a man in the kingdom who can interpret this message. He helped your grandfather. He will certainly help you. You need to send for him. And of course, this man's name is Daniel. Let's just remind ourselves about who Daniel was and what we know of him to this point, right? Daniel chapter 1. What do we know about Daniel there? Well, he was a man who stood firm for his convictions, didn't he? Remember when they were supposed to eat of the king's food and do all the different things that Nebuchadnezzar himself wanted them to do? Daniel refused to do it. And he suffered the consequences for it, but more than willingly. Daniel was faithful. In fact, chapter 1 verse 8 says that Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food. Well, herein is where Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar meet the first time, right? And Nebuchadnezzar realizes not only is this a man who is powerful, but he's a man of conviction. He is a man who knows what God wants. Well, chapter 2 comes and Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. Daniel again brought to discuss this dream with Nebuchadnezzar. And you remember, gives him the interpretation. So this relationship continues to grow. Daniel interprets the dream, and then Daniel is promoted by King Nebuchadnezzar at the end of chapter 2. Then we come to chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar's still not learning, and he sets up the golden image, remember that, and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refuse to worship this golden image, and they're thrown into the fiery furnace. God himself, Jesus, shows up in that furnace with those three men. And though the fire killed the very soldiers that put him in there, the fire touched not one of them. This was the company that Daniel kept. These were his friends. These were his brothers, if you will, his brother friends. They were known through the kingdom to be faithful to their God. We come to chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar again has a dream. But this time it's getting a little bit too far for Nebuchadnezzar and his pride, right? Daniel interprets the second dream for Nebuchadnezzar. And it is basically that he's going to be humiliated for his pride. And sure enough, that's what happens. Daniel references it in talking to Belshazzar. Literally, he went crazy. For 7 years, ate grass like an ox, crawled on all fours like a crazy man. This is the king. Until God finally humbled him, and you know the rest of the story. I believe Nebuchadnezzar is restored, and he says literally at the end that he praises and honors the King of heaven, right? For all of his works are right, and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. That's Nebuchadnezzar. Well, now Nebuchadnezzar's off the scene. He dies, his son takes the throne, his grandson, almost a co-ruler, and his grandson likes to party, likes to throw wild parties. And now we find ourselves in the situation where Daniel is once again being called in to interpret not a dream, but handwriting from God. A message nonetheless, not in a dream form, but in a written form. So Daniel's brought, verse 13, before the king. And he then begins to answer the question. The king says, "You're Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah." He said, "I've heard great things about you." He said, "If you do this, I'm going to enrich you, Daniel. I'm going to give you great riches. I'll make you the third ruler in the kingdom." Daniel's answer in verse 17 is great. He answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourselves and give your rewards to another." Daniel said, "I want to let you know that nothing that you're going to give me right now is going to change what I'm about to tell you. It's not going to change my message. It's not going to change the interpretation I know I need to give to you from God." So Daniel goes on, and he lays the very foundation, letting him know exactly who he is, and the fact that God did this for a specific reason. He says in verse 22, "And you, his son," speaking of Nebuchadnezzar, right? You, his grandson, really, Belshazzar, "you've not humbled your heart, though you knew everything that happened to your grandfather. But you've lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords and your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you've praised the gods of silver and gold." And this is what Daniel says. Belshazzar, you need to understand something. The God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways. In other words, he's saying, hey, Belshazzar, God holds every breath you take in his hand, in every one of your ways as well. And you've chosen to dishonor the God of heaven, despite the fact that you knew who he was. And so we come then to the proclamation of Daniel, which is really very, very serious. And it's what I just said. You've done wrong, Belshazzar. You've sinned against God, and now God is coming with a message for you. And here it is. Here's the interpretation, verse 24. Mene, mene, Tickle and Farson. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. It's a gracious interpretation by Daniel, isn't it? He used the word days. More like hours, right? Hours is all that Belshazzar had left to rule. But his days were numbered. Why? Tickle. You've been weighed in the balances and found wanting. He says, Belshazzar, you're too light. You're too light politically. You're too light morally. You're not the man who needs to be ruling or should be ruling in any way. Finally, he says, Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. You know what's interesting? When Belshazzar saw the writing of the message take place, his color left his face. His knees knocked together. He was shaking in fear. And then when the astrologers and all the magicians couldn't give him an interpretation, the same thing happened. But here comes Daniel and gives him the actual interpretation. And do you see Belshazzar reacting that way at all? If there was a time to be knocking your knees together and your color leaving, it would be after hearing that from Daniel. But in a strange way, that doesn't happen. Why? I don't think Belshazzar believed Daniel. I don't think he thought that was the right interpretation. Now, I don't know. It's not here. It doesn't say. All it does say is that Belshazzar kept his promise and gave Daniel all those rewards. Belshazzar was a young man. Thought he had all the time in the world. Reminds me of when I was traveling as a college student. I remember talking to a young man who had come to the war that I was holding. It was a set of youth rallies that we would do for a couple of days. And I remember he came and he said that he was under conviction that God was working in his heart about the fact that he didn't know the Lord and that he didn't know that he was on his way to heaven. And I said, so-and-so, I said, would you like to know that for sure? Do you know what he told me? Not right now. I've got too much living to do. He got in the car with 3 other teenagers. And they drove down the road. Not a mile from the church, they decided to race a train. It was in the country, and you could see the train for miles, and you could see it coming, you could see the intersection. And they raced through the intersection, and they didn't make it. All 4 of them were killed that night. They had just stopped at McDonald's just prior to deciding to race the train. And do you know what that young man's living consisted of? A Big Mac, fries, and Coke. That's all the living he had left. Belshazzar thought he had all the living. Young man, more parties to have, more parties to throw. I'm not going to believe this Daniel, who says my kingdom's coming to an end. No way, man. I'm too young for that. Well, what happens? Verse 30, the judgment of God comes just as Daniel had said. That very night. Wasn't a few days, it wasn't a few weeks, it wasn't a few months. That night! What Belshazzar didn't know is that the Medes and the Persians had diverted the Euphrates River. And they had been tunneling to get through the city, under the place where the river would come into the city. Babylon was completely fortified. But in an ingenious military maneuver, they diverted the water and they came in through the riverbed. And they conquered the city, killing Belshazzar. And probably many of the lords that were at that very party. Judgment was literally at the doorstep. And that night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. That was it. God's judgment came just as Daniel said. So what are some lessons that I think we should learn from this? There's a few of them. But this is what struck me as I thought about this. I don't ever want to read America into the Scriptures. It's not there. But the church is. The gospel is. And I think there's overarching applications for all of us here. Number one, I think a first lesson is this, that when a nation forgets God, that is the beginning of the end of that nation. Did you hear what I said? That when a nation forgets God, it's the beginning of the end for that nation. That's what happened here. Belshazzar, who was the ruler at the time, had completely forgotten God, forgotten all about what God had done for his grandfather, that his father at the end of his life died, I think, as a believer, who worshiped God and feared God and desired to serve God, and yet 2 generations later, his grandson rejects all of that. Forgets God, does the ungodly, and God says that's enough. Folks, I fear that in our own country, we're there. We're there. We have forgotten God. We've taken God out of our society in every way possible. And I would say it's the beginning of the end. And people would say, how can you say that about our country? I hope that America lasts much longer. But I'm going to tell you what, it's only going to last if God in His good graces brings a revival. And we see changes. And that can only happen through the preaching of the gospel. Look, it's not going to happen through societal reforms. I mean, we can protest abortion all day long. We can protest the immorality that's happening all across the nation. And I'm not saying that's wrong. That's good and right on the political side. But that's not going to help anybody spiritually. The gospel is the only answer. It is the power of God to salvation. The gospel needs to go forth. And this is where the church has to wake up. The American church, we are functioning in a country that has forgotten God. Whose responsibility is it then, folks, for the gospel to go forth? It is ours. It is our responsibility as a church to bring that gospel forward. But we're too busy. We're too busy. We have other things we'd rather do. We sit on our hands. And we forget that it is up to us. And folks, we can take the lazy perspective and say, you know what, God can do it if He wants to. That is absolutely right. But He uses means to accomplish His will, doesn't He? And what are those means? It's you and me. It's you and me. It's the work that we're called to do. It's the Great Commission of Matthew 28 that says, go! Go. And teach all nations. Folks, this is where we are at, and we have got to wake up. Judgment is at the gate. It's coming. The writing is on the wall. Number 2, nations. Listen now, nations come and go, but the church and the gospel remain. Nations come and go, but the church and the gospel remain. What does that have to do with this? Well, everybody wants to tie the church to America, right? And says, as America goes, so goes the church. And by the way, people also want to say that things are as bad as they've ever been or worse than they've ever been in history here in the United States and the world. And I think the Apostle Paul faced a much greater and much more immoral society than what we face. I mean, in Paul's day, there was open pornography everywhere you went in the Roman society. Everywhere you looked. I mean, I'm sure Paul and the other apostles probably had to walk with their heads down. They were probably, counting cobblestones as they walked down the street everywhere they went. Because they just simply couldn't look up. That's the society in which they lived. And it wasn't long before the Roman Empire, ceased to exist. England, right? It was said of the English Empire that the sun never set on the English Empire. They held countries around the world so that literally there was the sun shining somewhere in the world on some portion, some English colony somewhere. The English ruled the world, and they were also the source for many, many missionaries and gospel work that went out from England. I mean, the William Carys of the world went from England. So many others. But there was a time when the English began to take God out of their society. And what happened? The empire shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. And you look at England in the 21st century today, and there's almost zero impact of the church. And atheism is way up. What is to be of the United States? I don't know. But I do know that regardless of what happens, the church will remain. And the gospel will continue to go forward, even if we're ruled by China. Even if we're destroyed and ruled by some other country, the church is still going to be here. By the way, you know what the church is, folks? The church is like an embassy. You know what an embassy is, right? Countries have embassies in other countries. It's the place where their ambassador lives, the representation of their country in that country. That's what the church is. We're here temporarily. We're an embassy. We are part of God's kingdom, the heavenly kingdom, and we are here temporarily. We are here representatives of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And nothing's going to happen to us until God says it's time. It's time to go. It's time to be done. I'm coming back. So don't think for 1 second that as a nation forgets God, that nation goes away, and so does the church. No. The church has a much different mission, and that mission goes on until our King says it's done. Number 3, the church cannot remain silent in the face of sin or impending judgment. Think about Daniel showing up to talk to King Belshazzar. I think Daniel probably knew what he needed to tell Belshazzar before he showed up. He didn't get there and read the message on the wall and go, oh, I got to tell him that. God told Daniel what to say. God gave him the interpretation. Think about this for a second. It's kind of like Nathan when he had to go talk to David, right? I mean, what a scary position to be in. To tell the king, your kingdom's coming to an end and you're done, you're finished. For Nathan to tell King David, you're the man. And yet they fearlessly did it. And it reminds us that the church cannot remain silent in the face of sin or in the face of impending judgment. How often do we remain silent because we're afraid of what people are going to think? Because of the blowback we might receive? How often do you refuse to get into a gospel conversation with a friend or a relative or a fellow employee at work because you're afraid of the blowback? Folks, we just established that it's the gospel that's going to make all the difference in the world. We cannot remain silent as a church. We have got to be faithful in declaring the message that God has given to us. Message of the gospel. Which, by the way, includes some bad news, doesn't it? You better understand the bad news before you get to the good news. The gospel says all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. The gospel says that the wages of sin is death. That's the bad news. Bad news, we deserve to go to hell because of our sin, and every single individual and human being is in that boat. The good news is that God showed his love toward us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And that whoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. That's the reality. That's the gospel. But it's good and bad, isn't it? Folks, that's the message we have got to declare. And we cannot shrink back. Just as Daniel didn't shrink back in his message that he needed to share. Number 4. Shame on any pastor or church that hides their message at a time when it needs to be proclaimed the loudest. Shame on any pastor or church that hides their message at a time when it must be proclaimed the loudest. Daniel had a temptation here. Belshazzar said, hey, I'll make you the third greatest ruler, the third most powerful person in the kingdom, if you can give me this interpretation. I'll give you riches. I'll give you all this wonderful stuff. Do you remember what Daniel's response was? I'll paraphrase. Keep it. That's what he said. You can keep that, give your rewards to somebody else. I'm not here for that. I'm here to deliver a message. A message from the king to you, the king. Why is that important? Because there's so many churches today that are worried, oh, if I say that, nobody's going to come to my church. Oh, if we preach that, we're going to be labeled this. If we do that, then we're going to be not welcomed here. And folks, look, I'm not saying we should be like the meanest people on the block, right? I'm not saying that, right? You don't want to be so angry you could mug an Avon lady, okay? You don't want to be there. Just waking you up. Anybody there? Hello? Okay. Just making sure you're there. You don't want to be that person, right? There's a right way to do right things. There's a right way to say difficult things. But we have to say them. I think Daniel in his approach to Belshazzar wasn't arrogant. He wasn't as mean as a rattlesnake. He simply told Belshazzar what needed to be said. And folks, that is exactly what we need to do as well. And we need to leave the results up to the Lord. There's no time for us to sit back and to hide or to just try and build our little cliques called churches all around. Judgment's at the gate. The writing's on the wall. And shame on us if we hide the message that we need to declare right now when people need it most. Number 5, and there's just a few more I want to mention. Number 5, God always does what he promises he's going to do. God always does what he promises he's going to do. God promised judgment in this message to Belshazzar. And that very night, judgment came. I'm going to say something that might blow your mind initially, but I'll explain it, okay? The fact that people go to hell actually glorifies God. Did you know that? You say, how in the world? Well, let me explain. When God says the wages of sin is death, when God says all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, when God says that every man was in Adam at the moment that sin came into the world and death by sin, so death passed upon all men, for all have sinned. God can't ignore that reality, can he? So when people go to hell, they reject the gospel because of their own depravity, because of the love that they have for their sin. And they unfortunately, and it grieves my heart, but people go to hell every single day. And it's a terrible thing, but it backs up what God says is going to happen if a person doesn't come to the truth of the gospel, doesn't come to Christ. They will die and go to hell. So how does that glorify God? Well, it says that he does and means what he says. What kind of God would God be if he made all of those statements and then said, I'll look the other way? Parents, let me ask you the question. What if you had rules in your house and your kids disobeyed them and you looked the other way? How far does your authority go after that? Not very far, right? Now, in a very small way, that is what we're talking about. Nobody would respect a God who didn't back up what he said. Folks, real eternal judgment is coming, and God says and will do what he promises he will do. Number 6. There's just 2 more. Number 6, compromise always puts you on the wrong side of history. Compromise always puts you on the wrong side of history. Again, we return to Daniel here and the message that he had to give to Belshazzar. What if he had not given that message? What if he had just been swayed by the riches and swayed by what Belshazzar, it doesn't say any of these things, but if you read between the lines, sometimes I look at Belshazzar and who he was, and I think, man, maybe Belshazzar knew what he was doing here. Kind of like a little psychological game with Daniel. Hey, Daniel, tell me what I want to hear, and you can have all this stuff. The third ruler in the kingdom. All this great stuff. I don't think Belshazzar really wanted to know what it said. He just wanted to hear something, and something that made sense to him. Daniel had a choice. Say what Belshazzar wanted to hear, or say what God told him to tell Belshazzar. Thankfully, Daniel chose what was right. He gave the message the way it needed to be said. But folks, compromise always puts you on the wrong side of history. It's like the old country preacher said, the only thing you get when you straddle the fence is torn breeches. It's true. You can't straddle the fence when it comes to truth, folks. You can't be both things to the world and to God. You can't have it happen. It puts you on the wrong side of history every time. Lastly, there's 2 more, 7 and 8. Proclaiming the gospel, pushing back against sin always brings reward from God. And Daniel saw that reward later. He got the reward that Belshazzar said he was going to get. But even more, he pleased God in what he did. There was an audience of one, but that audience for Daniel wasn't the one Belshazzar. It was the Lord. It was God. That's who he was concerned with. Finally, we need to understand that we are here by choice and by the grace of God. So may we not disappoint our good and gracious God. It's like he said, the God in whose hand your breath is, and whose are all your ways. Belshazzar said, you've not honored. Folks, I would say the same thing to us, that we should remember the God in whose hand our breath is. He's the one who's put us here. He's the one who's given us a task. He's the one who's given us a message to proclaim. We cannot stand idle. We cannot sit back. There's work to be done. Judgment is at the gate. The handwriting is on the wall. We just got done celebrating the 4th of July. Patriotism, right? All over the place. I love being patriotic. The fireworks, the flag, the parades, it's a wonderful thing. But my friend, there's so much more to it than that. And if we really loved our country, as we say we do on the 4th of July, then we as Christians will be declaring the message of the gospel every single day, because that is the only answer for our country. That's the message. And folks, the question is, will we be faithful in declaring that message? Yes, we're Calvinists. And you know what? The Calvinists should be the most evangelistic. You want to know why? Because we know God's elected some. We know that there are people out there who will respond to the gospel when it's proclaimed. That's the motivation, folks. It says, as Jude says, let me close with this. In Jude, there's a great perspective that Jude puts on this, and it just came to mind, so let me just read it to you. It wasn't in my notes. But Jude puts it this way, and have mercy on those who doubt. Save others by snatching them out of the fire. To others show mercy with fear, hating even the garment stained by the flesh. And folks, we're not going to be able to save everybody, though I wish we could, but there's some that we can snatch from the fire. There's some that we can see that take place. Some within our own circles of influence right now. Folks, judgment is at the gate. The handwriting's on the wall. Don't sit on your hands. Don't sit on your hands. Don't think that there's nothing for you to do. There's everything for you to do. Be faithful. Be faithful with the message that God has given to us because the writing's on the wall. Let's have a word of prayer together. Our Father, I pray that you would help this message to sink deep within our own hearts. I know it's somewhat different than what we normally would look at on a Sunday morning, but Lord, it is a message that's needed for all of us. Father, it's a message that you brought to my own heart as we were away, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to share it with our folks this morning. But Lord, I pray that we would be faithful with the gospel. Oh, we can do so many other things, be involved in politics, be involved in all these other things, and those are good and right things. But I pray that even for our Christian politicians, Lord, that they would be declaring the gospel at every moment they have and not just be focused on changing morality. Morality is important, but the gospel is the only true way that morality will ever be impacted. The gospel is the power of God. Paul said, I'm not ashamed of it. And I pray, Father, for us that we as well would not be ashamed of the gospel. For it is the power of God to salvation. Thank you for your word, and thank you this morning for meeting with us. Help us to take these things to heart, I pray, in Christ's name. Amen.